We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
This is the story of what awaits us in space. It's the story of shuttles and space stations, of frightening possibilities and enormous potentials. What are the plans of the superpowers? Who else is joining the race for space? And how long will it be before we begin the journey to the stars? The territory ahead, next time on Spaceflight, commenced. After Apollo, America's space agency, NASA, turned its attention to building the world's first reusable space vehicle. Original plans called for a shuttle to be composed of 2 separate manned vehicles. The first would be a huge but reusable rocket plane to boost the shuttle into orbit. The manned rocket launcher would then return to the launch site. Budget constraints altered this plan, and a compromise was made. The manned rocket launcher was dropped. Instead, 2 reusable rocket boosters and a large throwaway external fuel tank were designed. Yet even with these cutbacks to save costs, the space shuttle proved an enormous challenge. The shuttle's first pilot, Robert Crippen.
We worked under some very tight budget constraints, and the way we elected to try to go through and do it with less money was to not do a lot of component testing, but wait until we had units built and then integrated and do what I would call integrated testing. That did come back and bite us in the long run. I'm not sure there's trade-offs. We were trading schedule versus money.
By the time the shuttle is rolled out for its first powered flight, it is 2 years late and some $1 billion over budget. Developing reusable rocket engines had proven an awesome engineering assignment. Receiving the most public attention, the shuttle's heat shield tiles. The 30,000 individually cut pieces of tile were designed to protect the shuttle from the intense heat of re-entry. But the tiles refused to stay put, even in atmospheric tests. Former director of the Johnson Space Center, Christopher Kraft.
There were many people that thought the space shuttle would burn up. A lot of smart people that thought the space shuttle would burn up during re-entry, that we were doing things wrong, that the tiles would not stay on the machine, that they would not survive the re-entry, that there'd be vibrations and forces on the tiles that would rip them off, that the stability and control of the machine was poor, and that the computer systems and the automatic control systems that work through the computer would be insufficient to properly control the machine during entry. All kinds of doubts in people's mind that during launch it would come unglued.
April 12, 1981. Countdown for the maiden voyage of America's first space shuttle, Columbia. On board are astronauts John Young and Robert Crippen. For the first time, these 2 men will fly into the vacuum of space atop a new rocket and a new spacecraft, neither of which have been pre-tested in flight.
Physically, riding the shuttle is a real thrill. I don't think I know of any other kind of a vehicle that could give you that kind of a ride. It starts about 6 seconds prior to the actual liftoff when we ignite the main engines, and the vehicle begins to shake, and there's a loud sound of the engines themselves. And then we light the solid rocket motors, which each put out 2.5 million pounds of thrust. And unlike some of our previous expendable boosters that lifted off kind of nice and slow, when those solids light, you're up and going, and there's no doubt in your mind that you're headed someplace.
Everything looks nominal there, man. What a view, what a view.
Glad you're enjoying it.
Daniel, that was one fantastic ride.
wish we could have been along.
Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Once in orbit, Crippen and Young inspect their craft. One view from the cargo bay confirms that all or part of 16 heat tiles are missing.
Here, we do have a few tiles missing off of both of them.
Roger, Crip, we can see that good.
The mission commander, John Young.
Of course, when we flew the first mission, we'd participated in many hundreds of engineering meetings where people had told us that when we returned, we would have statistically, now mind you, statistically, we'd have lost some tiles off the bottom of the vehicle.
Some engineers speculated prior to the flight that even one missing tile could cause a zipper effect, leaving the shuttle perilously vulnerable to the scorching temperatures of re-entry. There is only one way to find the answer as Crippen and Young begin their return to Earth.
271 knots. So it says it couldn't be any better. On glide slope. Approaching center line. Looking great. 30, 20, 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, down.
It's a very complex process to put on 30,000 tiles on a vehicle. Very labor intensive, and you can hardly believe the variety of people that worked on that vehicle. It takes about that much paper to put on one single tile, and they did it just right.
NASA believes its future rides with the shuttle. The U.S. agency hopes that its reusable glider will make access to space routine and relatively inexpensive. By the 1990s, NASA hopes its fleet of shuttles will be flying into Earth orbit every 2 weeks. With flights becoming almost commonplace, undoubtedly public fascination will lessen. But America's space agency is now pushing a new slogan. Space is no longer just a place to go, but a place to work. With this theme, the emphasis in astronaut selection is slowly but inevitably changing. Space, once the province of the test pilot, is now giving way to a new breed of astronaut, the mission specialist. America's first woman in space, Sally Ride.
I think that's right. The mission specialist is becoming much more the focus of the space shuttle program, and that's as it should be. And it's the mission specialists that are actually in charge of operating the experiments that we carry out, deploying the satellites, doing the spacewalks, all the things that the space shuttle is designed to be used for.
Many of NASA's flight plans are devoted to the launching of satellites. Each satellite gets a ride into low Earth orbit within the shuttle's cargo bay. From here, small rockets boost the satellite into a higher position, often a geosynchronous orbit some 22,000 miles above the Earth. At that altitude, the satellite travels at the same speed as the Earth's rotation, keeping it in a constant orbit over the same area of the globe.
Satellite deployments that we had on STS-7, my first flight, went very smoothly. From the moment that we powered up the satellites and started the deployment process to the time that the satellites made it to geosynchronous orbit, there were virtually no problems. Unfortunately, the shuttle goes to a low Earth orbit. It doesn't make it up to geosynchronous orbit, so we can't just take a satellite that's designed for geosynchronous orbit and leave it there. We've got to have some additional booster on the satellite to get it from the low Earth orbit to the geosynchronous orbit. And it's those boosters that we've had a little bit of problem with.
In 1983, 2 commercial satellites went astray due to booster failures. Another satellite was nearly lost when its booster engine malfunctioned, leaving ground controllers the task of placing it in a proper orbit. But having lost satellites, NASA has also started rescuing them. In April of 1984, the crew of the Challenger makes a house call in space. For the first time, they are to retrieve, repair, and return to orbit a damaged satellite, the Solar Max.
Satellite looks in excellent condition. Doesn't work.
Looking like a scene out of science fiction, astronaut George Nelson flies out into space and attempts to attach himself to the Solar Max. but the locking pin on Nelson's docking device fails to capture the satellite, and it begins a slow tumble out of control.
I don't know if I'm going to have enough gas to get in. Oh, what you got left? What you got left? At 1,200 on one.
Low on fuel, Nelson abandons the rescue and returns to the shuttle.
Okay, come on back in, thanks.
From Goddard Space Flight Center outside of Washington, ground controllers stabilize the spinning satellite by remote control. Having failed in their attempt to tow in the satellite, only one option remains.
We had come up with a backup plan pre-flight in case we had a problem with the maneuvering unit. Involved going over with our mechanical arm and grabbing the satellite while it was still rotating, and we had had a chance to train for that in a limited fashion.
The Challenger crew uses its manipulator arm to grapple the satellite into the cargo bay. The drama of the rescue was over, but for NASA's future, the most significant event was just beginning. For almost a full working day, astronauts George Nelson and James Van Hoften performed the first repair of a satellite, a major demonstration of the shuttle's ability to work in space.
He's looking good. He's lining up.
This impressive achievement was surpassed in November of 1984 by another rescue mission, one of the most spectacular episodes in the history of spaceflight. Having lost 2 satellites to wild orbits in 1983, NASA returns a year later to salvage them. After moving the shuttle within 35 feet of each of the errant satellites, they are hauled, literally by hand, into the cargo bay by spacewalkers Joe Allen and Dale Gardner.
Okay, I got my little grubby hands on it. Now you just kind of let me take it where I want it, okay? Yeah.
Secured in the cargo bay, the 2 satellites are returned to Earth for repair and resale. The shuttle's flexibility to perform tasks like these rescues makes it truly a space machine for the future. The Soviet Union is building its own version of the space shuttle. They are also close to launching a gigantic booster similar in size to the Saturn V rocket that took America's astronauts to the moon. This photo, released by the Australian government in 1983, shows the recovery of an early-scale model of a Russian space plane, a new type of vehicle being developed by both superpowers. According to reports in Aviation Week and Space Technology, the U.S. Air Force has on the drawing boards an orbital spacecraft capable of carrying a 20,000-pound payload directly into space from a conventional runway. Clarence Robinson.
Well, we have a requirement in order to be able to rapidly perform a mission into space in low Earth orbit for the military. And we could do that for a number of reasons. One is to use it as a kind of a space fighter. You could arm it with some sort of a kinetic energy kill missile system. You can use it to service your spacecraft on orbit. In the case of high-energy lasers that might be space-based, that plane could be used to haul tanks of chemical propellants up to refurbish those lasers once they'd engaged targets and expended their chemical propellants.
Such Buck Rogers scenarios are no longer science fiction. Space, for the modern military strategist, is the new battlefield. The U.S. Defense Department now spends more money on space than NASA, and the distinctions between military and civilian space programs are becoming increasingly blurred. NASA launched its first military shuttle mission in January 1985, the first of some 30 scheduled defense flights through 1990. News leaks of the first mission's classified cargo, a spy satellite to eavesdrop on Russian communications, caused a national uproar as government officials and the media debated the need for secrecy. Future military shuttle missions will be launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. For years, Vandenberg has been the blast-off site for satellites on expendable boosters. From this second Cape Canaveral, the shuttle can reach polar orbit, a necessary requirement for nearly complete monitoring and surveillance of the Earth. It is this new high ground, the vantage point for military command, control, and communications, which has America's defense planners looking up. Air Force General John Story.
I feel like we're really in the beginning era of space and space technology now, and I like to use an analogy of the airplane back in World War I when we really didn't know what to do with the airplane. They started out as reconnaissance, and it was kind of a gentleman's war in the air. And the German biplanes and the French and the British biplanes would pass each other on the way to to recon the other trenches. And they would wave at each other and, you know, and go do their bit, and they soon found out that the commander or the troops that had the best reconnaissance were winning the battle. So one day, as the two airplanes passed going the other way, one of the pilots took a .45 and took a shot at the other airplane. And the next day, the other airplane had a machine gun mounted on it, and he took a shot at him. And that's how they evolved finally into the big air battles of World War I and on. But I know you can't prove anything with an analogy, but we kind of feel like that's where we are in space right now in the beginning.
Some strategists believe that space will be the next new theater for war. Certainly future battles will depend heavily on space technology, navigation, communications, early warning, reconnaissance. Just how much detail and information can be spotted from space is a secret, but it is known that America's spy satellites possess an extraordinary capability. John Pike of the Federation of American Scientists.
If you were sitting out in the backyard having a picnic, the satellites could certainly count how many people were at the picnic. They could certainly count how many places were set at the table. They could count all the plates, and they could probably tell whether you were having watermelon or cantaloupe for dessert.
Because so many of today's weapon systems are based on high technology, events in a major military action will surely happen with lightning-like speed. The faster the conflict, the more both sides will rely on information provided by their sentries in space. Just one example is the United States Global Positioning System, or NAVSTAR. This satellite system will allow a soldier on the ground, a captain at sea, or a pilot in the sky to pinpoint his location to within a few feet anywhere in the world. This same precision technology is capable of making offensive strikes, from conventional arms to intercontinental missiles, deadly accurate. The more commanders rely on satellites, the more tempting they become as targets. America realized this in the very early days of space and developed the first anti-satellite weapon, or ASAT, in the 1960s. America's first killer satellite used a nuclear warhead. It assured a total knockout. The only trouble, it was so effective as to be totally indiscriminate, destroying both enemy and friendly satellites.
That was in response to a threat. At that time, the Soviets were coming up with a FOBS, or fractional orbiting bombardment system, which would come in underneath our warning system. It's not like an ICBM, and we built our ASAT in response to the FOBS. That system went away. The Soviets did not develop that capability, so we quit spending money on our ASAT.
In the meantime, the Soviets responded to our ASAT by creating their own. Besides ground-based efforts, the Soviets have developed and tested a killer satellite which is launched into orbit and maneuvers near its intended victim. When in close range, it explodes like a space-age grenade. Since 1968, the Soviet Union has conducted 20 known ASAT tests. Because of this threat, the next generation of American spy satellites, codenamed Keyhole 12, will have evasive abilities to dart and scoot into different orbits to avoid destruction.
The Soviets have had, for the last 10 years, a capability to shoot down our low Earth orbiting satellites, the anti-satellite capability. We do not have that capability. We are today developing that. We're being criticized by some protesters that say we're militarizing space and that we're destabilizing because we're pursuing this. It's just the opposite. It's destabilizing right now because the Soviets have the capability to take out our low Earth orbiting satellites.
America is making the next move with a new anti-satellite weapon. And once again, the technology of one side is leapfrogging over the other. The new American ASAT is carried aloft by an F-15 fighter. It is about the size of a basic air-to-air rocket, but contains extraordinarily precise heat sensors to track its target. The ASAT will lock in on its target with the help of the Space Defense Operations Center, located deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado.
There's a radio link that would be established between Cheyenne Mountain and between the F-15 that would feed updated targeting information from Cheyenne Mountain into the ASAT, the anti-satellite computer, which would then tell the F-15 where it wanted to go. So in a very real sense, the pilot of that fighter would just be along for the ride and to be monitoring the gas gauge. The plane itself would be flown by the missile, and the missile which was flying the airplane would be flown from a computer inside of Cheyenne Mountain. So it's all totally automated.
Congress has restricted testing of the weapon, but because ASATs are so difficult to verify, whether on an F-15 fighter or a Russian missile sitting in a silo, officials say there is little chance of a treaty. Military thinking is moving far beyond ASATs. The Pentagon and the Soviet Union are looking ahead to bigger systems, systems that can strike at the speed of light, the laser. And the Soviet Union may be leading the way. Clarence Robinson.
There is a place south of Moscow. It used to be called Krasnaya Pokra. It's now called Troitsk. And they have been working for some period of time at that location and in a number of physics institutes to try to perfect and package a space-based kind of a laser, a chemical laser. We are in the early stages of developing that kind of technology in this country. We believe that in the physics aspects, the Russians are probably ahead of us. We are perhaps ahead of them in the sensor surveillance capability and the onboard data processing required to track and engage targets. You should, however, realize that that's not limited only to anti-satellite capabilities. Any laser that can engage and destroy a satellite in space with a little more power also can engage and destroy ballistic missiles in the boost phase. So those are multi-capable systems in that they can destroy not only spacecraft with ballistic missiles and serve a ballistic missile defense capability. Now, the Russians have been trying to package that. They do not have the booster of sufficient size to launch it at the present time. They have, however, a very large booster in excess of our Saturn V class booster that they have been working on now for a number of years. That is being positioned and we believe will be tested by the end of the year. Once they get that capability to carry large, extremely large payloads into orbit, then it is more than likely that they will begin to test some kind of a laser system, a space-based laser system.
John Pike.
Testimony from various defense officials suggest, and I tend to agree with them, that the actual military capability of this initial space laser is not going to be very great. Generally, the Soviets prototype things much earlier in the development cycle than the United States does. And generally, once they get that prototype out in the field, they have to drive it around for several years before they can get the bugs out and get it working. And even once they get the bugs out of it, I don't think it's going to be that serious of a military threat. But Eisenhower didn't think that Sputnik was a very serious military threat, but the rest of the country recognized it as being some kind of political event. I think one of my very real concerns is that in the absence of some kind of political deal with the Soviets that would encourage some restraint on their part in this field, that they are going to put up this space laser. That's going to be the world's biggest flashlight militarily, but is going to shock this country in a way that it hasn't been shocked since Sputnik.
Perhaps mindful of the shock of Sputnik, America's military planners are developing a major new defense program, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Over the next 5 years, some $25 billion are to be spent in research alone on what has been called Star Wars technology. Lasers, particle beams, rocket boosters, new spacecraft, and more. Its director, Air Force General James Abramson.
It's probably worthwhile to go back just a little bit to the President's speech of March in 1983. And at that time, he really made a moral judgment, more so than trying to lay out a space weapon system. What he said was,
what if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies. I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. Yet current technology has attained a level of sophistication where it's reasonable for us to begin this effort.
Right now, this president and the president before him and all the presidents before them have no option. If there is one ballistic missile that comes in, his choice is to let it destroy an American city, let it wipe out a military capability, and just do nothing, and by doing nothing, encourage an additional strike, or to start a counterstrike, perhaps to start the end of the world.
A man who believes he's at least in part responsible for Reagan's Star Wars thinking is former Defense Intelligence Director Daniel Graham.
Well, it is my contention, and it is the contention of most of the intelligence community, that if the United States just sits back and does nothing, within 10 years, the Soviets will seize military control of cislunar space, that is, the space between here and the moon. And if they do that, then it really won't make much difference how many divisions or ships or planes we have down on Earth, because that is, in fact, the high ground of military capability now, space.
Graham's proposal is built around changing America's 20-year nuclear strategy of mutual assured destruction, or MAD. The MAD doctrine is based on the assumption that if both sides have the capability to annihilate the other, neither will act. Graham proposes building a three-tiered defense space system. The first two layers are made up of orbiting armed satellites that would seek out enemy missiles in their launching and coasting sequences. The third tier would be a ground-based buckshot-like arrangement protecting American missile silos. This potential disturbs retired Colonel Robert Bowman. As an Air Force officer in the 70s, he was responsible for the development of space weapons. Today, he is one of their most outspoken critics.
If you take a look at what they actually propose, each of the proposals has several layers, the last of which is always a point defense against our missile silos. The first layers, space-based layers, are so leaky, so many missiles would get through, that we always have to have that point defense around the missile silos. So it becomes obvious that what they're talking about when they say assured survival is assured survival of silos, not people. And what is the point of protecting missile silos? It's so they can exercise MAD.
Others criticize Graham's space defense because it ignores nuclear delivery modes other than spaceborne warheads, from a terrorist act to submarines to cruise missiles.
Fine, because nobody is going to try to first strike the United States with that kind of system. So you got to remember what you want the defense for. You want that defense to drive the possibility of nuclear war as far towards zero as you possibly can.
America has already successfully tested one anti-ballistic missile, codenamed the Homing Overlay Experiment. On June 10, 1984, a dummy warhead was launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base. The anti-ballistic missile, launched from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean, intercepted and destroyed the warhead some 100 miles out in space.
So we are trying to build systems that will destroy missiles without introducing nuclear explosions in the equation. That's one of the things that people felt is so such a difficult technical challenge. Well, we did it. We hit a bullet with a bullet, traveling in excess of closing speeds faster than 15,000 miles an hour, and we hit it head on.
Despite the success of the Homing Overlay Experiment, gigantic technical obstacles remain, a sober realization when considering the consequences of a less than perfect defense.
The problem with developing a system against ballistic missiles is right now we don't have the technology, the capability to build a foolproof system. Let's say that we had a system that was 90% capable of stopping every warhead the Soviets launched at us, and the Soviets launched 10,000 warheads at us, and we stopped 9,000 of them. That means we'd have 1,000 nuclear warheads impacting on the United States, and that's just not acceptable.
Action, reaction. Superpowers embraced in a seemingly endless technical dance of move and countermove. Space technology has helped forge a world in which we are all in some way held hostage. Can this same technology offer hope for the future? Or is the idea of space defense science fiction fantasy? This debate has implications far beyond the Strategic Defense Initiative itself. With the Soviets insisting that any arms agreement must hinge upon the elimination of Star Wars, our ability to control any and all weapons development may be at stake. Croft Erica, who died in 1984, held a special perspective on weapons in space. As a young German engineer in World War II, he helped build the world's first space weapon, a guided missile called the V-2.
I remember the time after World War II, where there was no doubt in anybody's mind that the ultimate weapon is the nuclear bomb. There can't be anything beyond this. Now we are talking about something to forestall the nuclear bomb. New weapons, laser weapons, in space, in Earth orbit. Now anybody who believes that we stay with these weapons in Earth orbit is naive. Of course there will be weapons in higher orbits that will attack those in Earth orbit, near Earth orbit. And then very quickly we'll be on the moon, because that's a very nice base from which to supply these things. It's a nice battleship. But what we have to consider is that the only end to this enormous weapons race is in the heads of people, not in a technological advance.
Not yet.
Another perspective on weapons in space from someone who's been there, former Apollo astronaut Rusty Schreikert.
Are we mature enough to understand that we've got to go beyond that, that this planet is the home of all life and that we are all one life? There's no longer room for us versus them. It's all we. That is the critical question of our time. We are going to make that decision.
There's another battlefront developing in space, and this one has nothing to do with weapons. It's space for high finance and profit. And in this case, the sky is definitely not the limit. No longer is space the province of just two superpowers. Japan, India, and China are now aggressively entering the space transportation business. 11 European countries have joined together to create a common market of space, the European Space Agency. ESA's expendable Ariane launch vehicle looms as a formidable competitor to the space shuttle. But the challenge to America's space program goes beyond launching capability. The newcomers to space are exploring a number of advanced space technologies, including building their own satellites. Despite the competition, there is cooperation. The European Space Agency built the billion-dollar space lab that is carried into space by America's shuttle. In exchange for a free ride into orbit, the science performed in Space Lab is shared by NASA and ESA. Still, the concern is that America may be losing its competitive edge. The shuttle has not turned out to be as attractively priced as NASA had hoped. Already companies, including some American ones, have turned to Ariane. America's Office of Technology Assessment warns that unless the United States is prepared to commit more of its public and private resources to space, it will lose its preeminence in space applications during the 1980s. Both technological and commercial leadership are at stake. This space version of supply and demand has caught the attention of individual entrepreneurs. Private investors have even tried to buy their own shuttle. Deke Slayton was one of the original 7 Mercury astronauts. Now he's helping to launch a new space effort.
Yeah, we're trying to put together a little commercial space program. The guy I work for is a visionary type guy. He had absolutely no experience with the space business at all. But in the late 70s, he got the idea that, hey, here's something that's the future of the country, and somebody ought to get in and do something about it commercially. And he and some of his friends joined together and using their own personal funds and tried to launch a little rocket a year ago down in Matagorda Island, and they got some bad advice and ended up blowing the thing up. But they didn't lose heart. Said, well, we'll press on, and they needed help. So I went to work for them, and we got a solid one off here in September very well. We're now trying to put together an orbital system. Our objective is to put small payloads around 500 pounds into low Earth orbit. And so we're designing a booster system to do that. We're designing payloads to go with it, and sensors and ground stations, and negotiating for launch sites and all of the things necessary to put a program together, and we hope better, more efficiently and cheaper.
Slayton's commercial group has recently added an unusual service to its list of potential payloads, a burial in space. For a fee, Slayton's company will scatter your ashes amidst the Van Allen radiation belt to circle the Earth for a minimum of 63 million years. Although most new space competitors are concentrating on unmanned space opportunities, NASA continues to place emphasis on its manned program. Other space programs, particularly unmanned exploration of the solar system and beyond, have suffered. While most Americans view the shuttle as a sign of a nation's technological strength, some critics see it as a symbol of the lack of consensus and direction for America's space program. The shuttle, it is argued, is a spacefaring truck with no place to go. NASA futurist Jesko von Puttkammer.
It is not just a transportation system, not just a truck, but also a platform astronauts and machines can work from in space, as we have seen. But the stay time of the space shuttle orbiter in space is limited. We can remain in Earth's orbit only about 10 to 12 days, and then we are forced to return to Earth because of consumables running low. For example, if you want to propagate rats to study life processes, or if you want to grow crystals or do other material processing experiments, you need more time on orbit than 12 days, and you need much more power than the space shuttle can provide. You need many more kilowatts of electricity. And there are other requirements. You need more vacuum, you need more volume, and you need more people and more skills. And all of those requirements cannot be satisfied by the basic space shuttle. So from those requirements, you are driven toward a space station.
We can reach for greatness again. We can follow our dreams to distant stars, living and working in space for peaceful economic and scientific gain. Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and to do it within a decade.
Reminiscent of John Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon by the end of the 60s, President Reagan has hitched his wagon to a star. The United States has always emphasized large, expensive manned space programs with deadlines to push them on. The space station is no exception. First estimates at the price tag of this 100-ton space station, $8 billion. By the year 2000, its total operating cost may approach $20 to $30 billion. The station will be hauled into low Earth orbit and assembled piece by piece. When completed, crews of 6 to 8 people will occupy it, staying aboard for cruises of 3 to 6 months. NASA mission specialist Bonnie Dunbar.
Well, I think if we look at a space station that we'll have in the next 10 years, it'll be multidisciplinary. There are many things happening. Be some physics, solar physics, astronomy, but a lot of materials processing. Gravity, as we know it, restricts a lot of the things we can do in chemistry and in making materials. And the simplest example is mixing two metals like aluminum and lead. Most people know that aluminum is much lighter than lead, and if they were molten, lead would sink to the bottom. Now, if you wanted to make an unusual alloy here of those two, that would be virtually impossible. But where there is the lack of gravity, or a very small amount of gravity orbiting the Earth, you might be able to do that. The G factors, we call it, is prevalent in many, many equations in materials processing. Eliminating it is going to give us a better insight to how the natural laws of the universe work.
Because of the microgravity of space, some materials can be made with greater precision and with fewer defects. Others, which cannot be made at all on Earth, may become possible for the first time. The space station will be an orbiting laboratory for medical experiments and a factory for the material processing of new pharmaceutical substances. The wonder drugs of the future may be found in this zero-gravity environment. The station will serve as an observation post for looking down at the Earth and out into the universe. It can function as a repair shop and launching site for satellites and interplanetary probes. If NASA's vision is correct, the space station will become a doorway to the universe. It is a vision of the future which is also shared by the Soviet Union.
They say their goal is permanent manned space station. There's no reason to doubt it. They're doing the right homework. They're preparing themselves to set these stations up.
They are keeping people in space for 6 months or longer. They're rotating crews back and forth from Earth to space and back again. And they're carrying out industrial activities in space. They're carrying out Earth observation. They're carrying out medical experiments to support long-duration flight. And they're carrying out other kinds of scientific research. Once they have their space station, once they have their bigger boosters they're working on, once they have experience, once they have more powerful upper stages, including perhaps nuclear propellant systems, which they've described as being useful, once they have that, the rest of the solar system becomes open. They've talked very, very grandly about flights out to the moon and to the planets in the next 15 to 20 years. They are doing the right things now to make those future steps come true.
But other futurists are looking back to the moon.
It is very important that we return to the moon, making a beginning soon, and that we return not like the Vikings went to America, but as members of a more advanced civilization, as the Columbian civilization viewed America. So we need, from the Viking phase of the moon, we need now the Columbian phase of the moon. We have to return to the moon to stay. That is very important. What makes the moon different and important at the same time to Earth? First of all, it is a world that is of planet size. Number two, it is at the cosmic beach of Earth. It is, if you will, an island whose people naturally become seafarers. The third point is that we are locked on a planet that is totally unrepresentative of those bodies of the solar system to which we have access. Mercury, Mars, the satellites of the outer planets. And the moon is far more representative of those environments than is Earth. So if we can handle ourselves on the moon, industrially, culturally, and from the standpoint of civilization, from the standpoint of becoming cosmic, becoming three-dimensional, become true cosmopolitans, then if we can do that on the moon, then we can do it everywhere.
If the Apollo astronauts were prospectors, then the next visitors will return as miners, and they will excavate the moon for its resources. Here are the materials to build our solar-powered stations, space colonies, and starships of the future. Futurist Jerry O'Neill.
Back in the late 1960s, a time of great questioning of all technology, I asked my students at Princeton the question, is the Earth really the right place for an expanding industrial civilization? It turned out, as the answers came back, that the answer was very clear. It was no. An industrial civilization like our own is really better served in the long run by spreading outward into the solar system and building space colonies where all of the industrial and agricultural activities of the human race can be carried on at far less environmental impact and with far more efficiency than they can be on the Earth. A space colony will be a large rotating sphere, about a mile in circumference, slowly rotating to make Earth normal gravity for the people living on the inside. Space colonies can be located anywhere in the solar system, and you calculate out how much material there is, how much energy there is to drive them. There's room there for expansion for the human race for thousands of years.
Yet, in the near future, it will probably be machines, not humans, that will explore our solar system. The first interplanetary probe was launched a quarter of a century ago. Since then, we have seen the first glimpses of our planetary neighbors. These extraordinary pictures are from the surface of Mars, taken by the Viking 2 lander. The Voyager has had its close encounters with Jupiter and Saturn. Pioneer 10, launched more than a decade ago, has now left our solar system on an infinite journey through the stars. We are discovering more about the universe with the infrared astronomical satellite. IRIS sighted the first sign of a solar system revolving around another sun, Vega, the third brightest star in the sky. It has also found previously unknown comets and asteroids, and evidence of a collision between two heavenly bodies. Even more dramatic discoveries are expected by NASA's Space Telescope. When launched into orbit, free from the Earth's atmosphere, the Space Telescope is expected to see close to the edge of the universe, some 14 billion light years away. Peering so far into the distance is like looking back in time. The Space Telescope may see the birth of galaxies billions of years ago. In doing so, we may answer questions about the nature and fate of the universe itself. Closer to home, NASA's unmanned planetary program is now directed towards an exploration of Jupiter, the fifth planet from the Sun and the largest in our solar system. Some 2 years after being released from the shuttle, Galileo will arrive at Jupiter. Galileo will circle the giant planet for 20 months. Then part of the spacecraft will plunge into Jupiter's atmosphere. The hope is that the probe will operate for nearly an hour, despite the intense heat and pressures. The mission's chief engineer, Gentry Lee.
The primordial constituents of the solar system are hydrogen and helium, and they don't exist in abundance except around these great big gas bags, which is the way we refer to the outermost planets. The hydrogen and helium has left the Earth because we don't have enough gravity. And by looking at how these various elements are there and what they're doing, and counting them, we can see something about the picture of the solar system at the time it began to put itself together. So there's a lot of sort of looking for the fingerprint of the beginning of the solar system by going to Jupiter, because it is the most primeval of all the planets.
Today, more than 50% of NASA's budget is devoted to the shuttle alone. As in the past, space science and unmanned missions have taken a second priority to manned missions.
If we do, here in the United States, back away from our lead role in the exploration of the solar system, we could conceivably go down in history as the Portugal of the 20th century. History records only that Portugal went out first to find all these things, and it was the Dutch and then the English that really managed to reap the benefits of what the exploration was. There are other plans right now. There's a Venus radar mapper that's funded. There's a Mars geochemical climatic observatory that is also funded. But these are not grand missions with multiple instruments trying to find out a myriad of different things.
We are just now peering into the far distance of the universe. But when will we travel to the stars?
We could start just like Voyager is doing. Of course, both Voyager 1 and 2 are flying to the stars, equipped with greeting cards. So it's not out of the question that we could build a manned space colony, which instead of circling Earth, would coast out into space, taking its own good time, maybe 40,000, maybe 400,000 years to reach the next stars.
When we talk about going to other star systems, we're talking very far ahead, probably anything from 100 to 200 years from now, I would say. Eventually, it's surely going to happen, and the people who go off to other stars are certainly going to be people who have been raised in space colonies in our solar system. The science for how we would do it is very clear-cut. The only energy storage mechanism that's strong enough to do the job is matter-antimatter. The one thing about the old Star Trek series that was scientifically accurate. The engineering certainly isn't here, but over 100 years, a lot of engineering can be done. There certainly will not be any human space flight to other star systems until the speeds of the spaceships can be brought up fairly close to the speed of light. I'd say 60 to 70% of the speed of light, so that the duration of the voyages can be cut down to a few years. A very good reason for that, because there's no point in going until the speed gets that high. Because if you embark on some very slow starship that's going to take many generations to go from here to there, the progress of technology back home is going to catch up, and people are going to be racing past you in more advanced designs.
If the entire technology that we understand today were perfected, in other words, if the raw physics, the models that we understand today were made into propulsion systems with high efficiency, it would still take us hundreds of years to get any spacecraft to the nearest star. One of the things that we have tried, all of us, to explain to people is that, you know, you and I, belong to a very important generation. We're the only ones that will explore the solar system for the first time, and it'll be many, many generations before there's any exploration of the stars. In 500 years from now, the students will look back on the time that we've been alive with the same sort of rhapsodic feeling that we have when we look back at the time of Da Gama and Frobisher and Magellan. The distance across our solar system, when compared to the distance to the nearest star, is like a ratio of 1 to 10,000. And so it is a gigantic step. to go out and start exploring the stars. Now, I believe that there will be an adventurous spacecraft before too many more decades, hopefully an international one. I'm a great believer that since this activity belongs to all of mankind, it should be basically supported by all of mankind. And we'll probably send out a spacecraft that may arrive in, as many as 1,000 years, be sort of like a time capsule. And will be more important for us as a species to try to understand what kind of spacecraft we would send as an emissary to someone else than it might actually be from the point of view of science.
When we will begin the journey to the stars, the voyage to neighboring planets, or even return to our own moon is unclear. Yet we are all space travelers. Throughout the ages, we and our ancestors have glided through the universe aboard spaceship Earth. But it is our privilege to live when life is first emerging from the womb of the Earth. If we survive the inherent risks of our technology, sometime in the next century, that very same technology will allow us to become a spacefaring civilization, to set sail on a new ocean full of cosmic wonder.